Dr. Burin, how are you?
Doing really good, thank you.
I'd just like to start off by having us describe a little bit about what we do, where we work from, just to give a little bit of context of who we are and what we'll be talking about today.
Sounds great.
My name is Chandler Smith. I'm the marketing coordinator with Precision Measurement Engineering. I work from coordinating trade shows to creating case studies. And then I thought it'd be an interesting idea for us to talk to Dr. Burin and others like himself that have helped us create case studies and talk to them directly and kind of get a little bit deeper into the work that they do with some of the products that they buy from us. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a professor at Cal State San Marcos, which is in northern San Diego County, along with your company. And I've been there for 13 years teaching physics. My research specialty is in fluid dynamics and in plasma physics. And I do experimental measurements of turbulence and turbulent fluids, which led me to use your probe.
The instrument that Dr. Burin is referring to is the Nisky, or the microscale conductivity and temperature instrument. Can we go a little bit into how this instrument helped you with your work in the lab?
Of course, yeah. So I'm interested in fluids that are sometimes stratified, and that is to say that they have different densities, different depths, or different parts of the fluid. And they have different densities due to different reasons. One might be a different temperature, and one might be a different salinity. And so being able to measure the conductivity, which is a proxy for the salinity, and being able to measure the temperature with a single probe is a very handy instrument for these kind of studies.
It's really interesting. I'm really curious about your work because a lot of the people that we have case studies for, researchers, professors, government officials, a lot of the case studies that we have are on projects that are done outdoors. And so this is something that's different. This is a controlled experiment in an indoor lab. I'm curious as to why it had to be that, why it couldn't be an outdoor experiment.
Well, it could be. The type of phenomena I'm interested in stratified fluids and turbulent fluids, are often found in nature, of course. But sometimes to better understand what we think is happening in nature, we need to isolate and see if we can recreate some aspect of what's happening in nature in the laboratory, away from kind of undesirable variables, if you will. And so to recreate a piece of the environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you take us a step-by-step kind of a simplified idea of how you went through this? Of course, you can find his case study, his work on our website, www.pme.com. You can either press the products page at the top and you can find case studies there, or on the homepage, you can scroll down to the bottom and there's a case study link there. You can find his work with the Nisky in the lab at CSUSM. But I'm curious from your words, from your perspective, how, a basic idea of how you went about coming to conclusions.
So the idea, again, and this idea of stratification, is we want to have water that's heavier on bottom, which is a stable arrangement. And the heavier is the saltier water example. So we have a separate tank where we have saltier water that then is kind of seeped to the bottom of a larger tank. And this larger tank is in rotation, by the way, to kind of simulate this sort of dynamics in a way that it would experience being on the planet. And one of the things particular to the set of experiments I worked on is it tried to touch upon the topic of double diffusion. And this is when you have, well, diffusion happens when you put anything in liquid or a fluid. But in the case of the environment, oftentimes there are different diffusing agents. And so when you think of salt diffusing in water, and when you think of temperature diffusing in water, they don't diffuse at the same rates. And that difference in diffusion rate can lead to some interesting effects. And those effects were what I was trying to focus on. So in light of a setup, we would then create a hotter, saltier water that was denser than the top layer water, and kind of insert it quietly and as smoothly as possible underneath a larger body of water that was less salty and cooler. once that was set up, then these double diffusive effects and a few other turbulent effects would come into play. And then the probe was then used. We actually used a series of probes focusing on one, but we had an array of 3 of these Nisky probes. And then they would be lowered from the top into the water. And then it would go through the top layer, which again was not salty at all. It was relatively cool. And then as it went down, it would eventually reach this hotter, saltier layer of water. And then between the 2 distinct layers, there was this interesting interface. And that's where all the physics is that we were focusing on. And as we went through that interface between the hot, salty water and the cool, fresh water, we would be able to get from the probe detailed measurements of the temperature and the density through the conductivity measurement, which is what made the probe so useful.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That was wonderful. I'm curious. So if I understand correctly, you were kind of slowly introducing the warmer, salty water from the bottom as smoothly as you could?
Yeah, that's right.
So was there a process where you stopped introducing the hot, salty water that was beneath the not salty, colder water? How long was that allowed to diffuse and mix before the Nisky was introduced to make measurements?
Not long at all. We inserted the water for a few minutes, and this would create, the tank was rather large that I did this experiment in. It wasn't an experiment I did in my lab in San Marcos. It was an experiment in eastern France where they have a very large rotating, effectively a rotating swimming pool. It's 13 meters in diameter, about 40 feet. Yeah, it's really quite a sight. And as it's rotating, they have a platform where you can actually stand in the frame of rotation while it's happening. So imagine a big rotating above ground swimming pool that this is happening on. It's quite
That's incredible.
It's called the Coriolis facility. It's in Grenoble in eastern France. So where was I? So as we were doing the experiment, we would insert the water for a few minutes, and things start happening immediately. You can't tell a turbulent fluid, all right, pause while I wait for something else to happen. It's all just kind of happening in real time. So we would insert the probes shortly, even while it was still mixing and equilibrating. Because the tank was so large, again, about 40 feet in diameter, the amount of fluid we put in didn't reach the edges. So what would happen, we would get these basically hurricane-looking structure, and people interested in this can see pictures of it, you know, on either the connections on your website or on mine. And so it forms a vortex. It forms like a hurricane-looking structure, except it's submerged. It's an underwater, rotating, distinct body of water that develops features like arms and things like you'd associate with a hurricane. So that in itself is very interesting, but that's all happening, that's all happening, if you will, laterally. And the interesting thing we were looking at, because that would happen even if you don't heat the water. That would just happen if you just introduce water into more water that's not rotating. It will start to counter-rotate and create kind of an internal hurricane or vortex. What's further interesting and what we're hoping to look at is when you heat it, but it's salty. And I should probably emphasize that the heat and the salt work against each other with regard to density. The salt wants to make it denser. The heat wants to make it less dense. And so you could actually have the same density as the surrounding normal fluid, except you're hotter and saltier. And those two effects are canceling each other. So it's a distinct body of water that's the same density as the adjacent normal water, but it's very distinct because it's hotter and saltier, but those effects are canceling. And this is the inspiration for creating this kind of vortex in the lab. It comes from these things called MEDIs. And they are vortices that come out of the Straits of Gibraltar from the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea tends to be hotter than the Atlantic, warmer, I should say. And because of evaporation, it tends to be saltier. And so when water comes out of the Mediterranean, it can sometimes form these vortices that are hotter and saltier, and they create these underwater vortices or hurricanes. They're called Mediterranean eddies, or MEDIs for short. Kind of cute.
I was curious. Yeah, I was curious. I've heard of eddies, of course, but you said it MEDIs. So okay, so Mediterranean eddies.
Yeah, and they have.
So
yeah.
Could you say basically that some of the work that you're doing in the lab could apply to instances in these METIs?
Yes, in fact, that's actually the hope and the aim. One of the uncertainties of METIs, and these things have been followed in a boat for over a year, and people are following along, and they last for a long time. You think of like Jupiter's red spot, there for hundreds of years. They're very coherent, but they eventually dissipate, they eventually decay, they eventually break up. And from a fluid dynamical perspective, we're interested in knowing just why that happens. Is it the double diffusion, which I referred to? Are there other fluid dynamical instabilities that are coming into play? And so the idea is then to create miniature versions of these and then try to understand the best we can whether we can extrapolate laboratory results to those kind of natural phenomena such as METIs. And then there are other instances of double diffusion where you have a hot, saltier layer underneath a cooler, fresh layer, and it leads to these very interesting kind of staircase structures as you go up. And the probe, the Nisky probe, saw that above the vortices that we created. But we see these in polar seas also, where you can think of like cold water coming off an iceberg that's really fresh because it's from the ice. And underneath is like the ambient ocean, which is saltier and maybe a tad warmer. That kind of situation also leads to what are called thermohaline staircases or double diffusive staircases. And it's a fascinating aspect of nature where it seems to just organize into this structure. It literally looks like a staircase. And apart from the aesthetics of it, which is very interesting, there's a real issue of, in terms if you think of like global climate and energy balances, to which the poles can be quite sensitive. We want to know, how does heat go through these staircases? Like, does it impede the heat? Does it enhance? Does the turbulence, like, how does energy and also things like salt, how do they transport once you have this staircase? Is it prohibitive? Does it promote it? And there are some questions. There's been some experiments in the past on that, but the experiments have been a little limited, and they haven't involved things like rotation, which we wanted to employ in working with our, I call them mini METIs, for what it's worth.
Right, yeah. Well, Dr. Burin, it sounds like you're doing amazing work. I'm fascinated. You mentioned that our viewers could find your work on a different site. Could you send them to that? Is there a link that they could follow?
Usually, so again, I'm based at California State University, San Marcos, which is part of the California State system. And usually on my website within the physics department, I link to my work. And this work was recently published in the journal Physical Review Fluids. It was published in June, I believe the June issue, but it was just late spring, early summer of 2020, just a few months ago. And yes, and that's where they could kind of read the condensed scientific version of all of this.
That's fantastic. I love what you're doing. It sounds like extremely interesting work. Everybody check out Dr. Burin's work at CSUSM. Check out this particular case study as well, www.pme.com, at the case study section at the bottom of the homepage. It sounds like he's doing amazing work. Look into it a little bit more and see how the Nisky has helped him realize some pretty cool science. Thank you, Dr. Burin.
I have one more thing I should mention too, that people considering this probe, a little anecdotal story. People probably assume that I'm in North County, San Diego, you're in North County, San Diego. I needed a probe and I like looked for local dealers and hey, there you guys are. That's certainly not the case. I was actually in Eastern France and talking about the experiment with people there, and they were like, "Oh, these are the best probes," and they were short supply at the time actually, and these probes, and I was like, "These probes sound great. Do you get them from London? Do you get it from Paris? Where are these things from?" And I look on the box, and it's from like where I'm from. It's like,
hey, like your neighbor, your neighbor,
like bumping into someone overseas, and so. These things are well regarded overseas, and certainly here in the States as well. They're the state of the art still, although they've been in production for a number of years, kind of a legacy production, I understand. Certainly, yeah. Really nicely made probes that really do the job well. And We really appreciate them. We even, I'm not kidding, people were actually saying, hey, if you come back, maybe you can bring some probes through customs without them noticing. And yeah, these probes look too much like a gun. I don't think I'd pull it off. But anyway,
Yeah.
one of these, they're in demand.
Dr. Burin, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate everything you had to say.
No problem. Glad to talk about these things.